It's my pleasure to be talking today. And so as Pauline mentioned, I'm going to be talking about evaluating disease control strategies using modeling approaches. And it's mainly going to be lessons learned from one of the projects I've been working on over the past few years here. So as Pauline said, a little bit more about me. Originally Canadian, so none of the mess in North America is my fault. When I was graduating high school, I actually was debating between being an aerospace engineer and a veterinarian, and I decided I didn't want to spend my day staring at numbers and statistics, and so I went to vet school. And then I became an epidemiologist to spend my day sitting at a computer staring at numbers and stats. So after my degree at University of Pennsylvania, I went to Edinburgh for 3 years, where I was modeling BVD and bovine tuberculosis on the British cattle movement networks. Went back to Philadelphia to practice for a couple of years, brief stint at Texas A&M, and then was finally lured down to the exotic wilds of Palmerston North in 2015, where I've been teaching at Massey, mainly actually because of the project I'm going to talk about, which is modeling those two diseases in New Zealand. So New Zealand, if you're not very familiar with it, only about 5.1 million people, very well known for its scenery, more recently for its hobbits, and even more recently for its COVID strategies. We've been lucky so far, not so much this week. We've now got cases again. In terms of the cattle and animal populations here, we have about 10 million total cattle split between dairy, 6.1 million across 12,500 farms, and about 3.9 million beef cattle across 30,000 farms. Lots of sheep, 26 million. And there's also a small deer industry here of about 2 million. So it's very much a pastoral production system based country, and most of it's located in the low-lying regions on the coast, and more the sheep and beef up in the mountainous regions of New Zealand. So mainly I'm going to today focus on the cattle population, because for New Zealand, that's a major part of its economy. And so naturally, the government is very interested in being able to manage these populations, and particularly when it comes to diseases. So it's actually a relatively boring place to be an infectious disease epidemiologist, because we just don't have that many here. So the ones we currently have under national control are bovine tuberculosis. So that control program has been in place now for about, I think it's 30 or 40 years almost, and very low prevalence now. And then more recently in 2017, we've had mycoplasmic bovis incursion, which is now under national control. There used to be enzootic bovine leukosis, but that was successfully eradicated in 2008. So the main diseases we worry about here from a population perspective are Johne's disease, lepto, Theileria orientalis, and bovine viral diarrhea. So coming to New Zealand as an infectious disease modeler, that didn't leave exactly a lot of choices for it. So I didn't want to touch Johne's disease because of the poor diagnostic tests. Lepto was out because there's too many wildlife reservoirs. Forget Theileriosis because those tick vectors. So pretty much none of those ones are really good candidates for national control, and very complex to model because of their epidemiological properties. Bovine viral diarrhea definitely had a lot more potential, particularly since we know from European eradication programs that it can be successfully controlled. And so that led to a lot of questions around, can we actually get a national control program in place for BVD, and what might that look like? So there's a lot of things in BVD's favor in terms of being a good disease to eradicate. The first one is that we really understand the epidemiology of this disease quite well. And so I've just got a little diagram there if you're not too familiar with it. But basically, if you're a cow, you start out susceptible, you get infected with BVD, you become transiently infected for a period of about 2 to 3 weeks before recovering and gaining lifelong immunity against the virus. If you are born to a recovered dam, you get maternal antibodies that protect you for about 6 to 10 months, at which point you become susceptible again. And if your dam was pregnant and you got infected during about days 40 to 120 of gestation, you have the potential to be born a persistently infected animal, which becomes viremic for life, sheds a ton of virus, and ends up being the main source of transmission. So what we know from the epidemiology is like getting rid of those persistently infected animals and stopping them from infecting others is really the key to BVD control. We also know that it has significant impacts on animal health, welfare, and productivity. So infertility, abortions, birth defects, growth rates, reduced milk yields. So this is a disease that's having major impacts on the industry itself, not only from a financial perspective, but also welfare. I think most farmers would be absolutely horrified walking out to the field to find calves that had cleft palates like this, or hydrocephalus, or mummies. So lots of reasons why it's good to actually control it. unlike many of our other diseases, we have excellent animal level and herd level diagnostic tests that are very sensitive and specific for detecting those PI animals. We have a lot of opportunities to perform the testing. So for example, we can take ear punch biopsies on calves when they're tagged and test for BVD at the same time. And in dairy herds, we can use bulk milk testing samples as initial screening tests, as well as serological tests for dry stock. So we have a very good ability to find those infected herds and find those infected animals within herds. We also have very effective control measures. So typically that would be culling, so removing and preventing PI animals, and vaccination also to help break those cycles. And last but not least, we have a lot of precedent for eradication from the European programs. So I think New Zealand has a sort of strategy of like waiting to see what the rest of the world does for disease control and then trying its own. But certainly there's enough models from overseas so that we know that eradication actually does work. So the main question we had when I was here way back in 2015 was to be BVD free or not to be BVD free. That was our main research question. Because certainly at that time, there'd been a lot of changes in the industry with getting a national traceability system up and running. And we had the diagnostic test introduced and the vaccines introduced. So at the time, it seemed like we had all the factors in place to really think seriously about putting a national eradication program in place for New Zealand. So we put in for a big funding grant back in late 2016, which was approved in 2017. To build a business case for BVD eradication. It was originally supposed to be a 3-year research program running from 2017 to 2021, but then COVID happened. So a lot of the things we'd initially planned ended up getting juggled around a bit. But the basic idea was that we were, when the project launched in July 2017, we were going to run some field studies, do some surveys, analyze some historical data to get the information we needed, convert that into a simulation model, and from that, come up with a business case for what a national eradication program would look like for New Zealand and what the benefits and costs would be. And that what was supposed to happen with the last year of the project is running an extension campaign to get that information out there and see if we could engage farmers and vets in controlling disease. And then the project was supposed to end back in July 2020. But then at the same time we were trying to run this, we had the Mycoplasma bovis outbreak in July 2017, and then the announcement about eradication in late 2018, and then COVID-19 running for a year and a half. And so a lot of the things we'd initially planned ended up getting a little bit out of whack, but we still got some really good results from this project, which I'm going to share in this presentation today. So one of the cornerstones of this project was developing a simulation model that we could use to actually inform decisions about whether or not to go for eradication in New Zealand. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the lessons we learned trying to construct these, because it's something like I'd had some experience from with my PhD, but it's not until you actually sit down and are having to do it yourself that you realize all the limitations and ways that we could have probably done things a little bit better. So I'll talk briefly about the model objectives, how we define the different components of the models, how we picked a structure for it, the parameters, the outputs, conditions, uncertainty, and validation. So for model objectives, I think it's an excellent question of why do we build simulation models to evaluate disease control strategies? And I think the main reason is really around this, that we don't have unlimited money and resources to control disease, which means that we often can't do like the gold standard or pick everything we necessarily like to. We also don't have the Star Trek tricorder to be able to automatically diagnose animals. We don't have a magic pill that's going to treat them for everything. And so oftentimes we're left making decisions and weighing up our different options. And it's not always clear to us what path we should actually take when it comes to disease control. And obviously in the real world, while you can do some experiments with individual animals and herds, it's really tough to experiment with a national control program just because of the significant costs involved in setting that up. And like once you start one, there's no control group to be able to figure out why that might be different. And so simulation models really give us that ability to make a virtual world that we can play around with and try out lots of different things and see what happens. And if we're lucky, even though it's not like quite a crystal ball, and that's where I think some of our policymakers get a little bit confused by modeling, they can at least give us some hints about what might be better choices or not. So it's never going to be perfect, but it gives us a little bit more information to base our decisions on. So our objectives, again, for the BVD-free project is we wanted to know if it would be cost effective to control BVD at the herd and industry levels. And so our main interest was in getting a benefit cost ratio of different potential program designs, because we know that the ones in Europe have been cost effective, but the farming systems in New Zealand are quite different. And so we weren't quite sure if the same trends would be seen here. So in terms of the different model components, the first one to address was the demographics. And so that's just looking at how the population normally functions in the absence of disease. And I like to break that into three components. One is the physiological state. So that's if you are an animal, what happens from you from the time you are born up until you die. And if you're a cow, that's usually you're born, you grow for a bit, you're weaned, you go through puberty, pregnancy and lactation through several cycles of that until you reach the end of your productive life, and then you're culled. We also have normal management events. And so those are the actions that farmers are taking to manage cattle through those different physiological states. And that's things like disbudding and castration, and weaning, mating, calving, movements on and off farm for sales, grazing, and then finally culling. And then what we're really interested in is how much are these farms actually producing? And so what are their outputs in terms of calf sales, fattening stock, milk yields if you're a dairy herd, and culled cows. Because if it wasn't profitable, then they wouldn't be operating under normal conditions. And certainly with disease, it's going to be even less profitable. So I mentioned that the New Zealand systems are a little bit unique. When I moved here, you can basically take everything I learned about cattle production, throw it out the window, and start from scratch. Just the terminology and the systems for rearing it were so different than what I was used to training in the States and then doing my PhD in the UK. So these are predominantly spring calving pasture-based or extensively grazed cattle production systems. Typically, most of our calvings occur around July over about a 9 to 12 week period. Mating occurs between October and December. Oftentimes they'll do pregnancy scanning and detection in February. Then beef cattle are weaned around April, May, and dairy herds are dried off around April to May. And then we have a winter dry period where there's absolutely nothing going on for a while. It's also very common in New Zealand for the replacement heifers to be grazed offsite. So usually it's called a mate-to-mate contract. And so they're sent away for 12 months. They're bred offsite, and then they return about 2 months prior to the start of calving to return to the herd. And it's also very common for adult cows to be sent offsite for winter grazing. And from an epidemiological perspective, that creates a lot of risks, particularly for BVD, if cattle, those replacement heifers go offsite, get infected during pregnancy, and come back to give birth to a PI calf. So if you're an animal yourself, after birth, as I mentioned, weaning tends to occur usually around, if you're dairy cattle, usually around September, October. For beef cattle, around April, May. Grow for most of a year. Puberty hits and mating is done usually in October when they're about 15 months old. Calve at 24 months old, although some farms will calve at 36 months old. And then they go through those different cycles of lactation, dry off, mating, pregnancy until culling. So some unique differences compared to those year-round calving systems up north. So in terms of the disease component, that's looking at what are the different epidemiological states and clinical impacts that the animal can experience. And so by epidemiological states, I usually think about it as the exposure status. So understanding when they're going to have antibodies, because that's obviously important for our diagnostic tests and control programs to look for evidence of previous infection. We want to know their infectious status, so which animals are exposed but not infectious, infected and infectious, and those that are recovered or chronic carriers. And then also important is the clinical status, because in some diseases we can diagnose them or at least have a suspicion of it based on clinical signs. But then those clinical impacts can also cause the morbidity we see and the mortality, which is associated with the clinical impacts. There aren't actually that many clinical impacts that disease can have on an animal. It's typically going to be poor growth, delayed puberty, reduced fertility, poor conception, pregnancy losses, reduced milk yield and quality, loss of body condition, and death. And I think pretty much every infectious disease is going to end up impacting one of those different clinical areas, predominantly reproduction and production. So again, for BVD, we have a very good understanding of both the disease and the impacts. So this is, again, just a quick model of it. And the main effects are really with the transient infections during pregnancy or during the mating period, because that will cause either failure to conceive or early embryonic death or abortion. If it's infected late during pregnancy, congenital defects or stunted growth. And then if it's infected mid-pregnancy, we get those PI animals. We tend not to see the same problems with reduced growth rates in New Zealand among young stock. That's because everything is reared extensively here. And so you don't get those secondary respiratory infections or gastrointestinal infections like you tend to see in feedlot cattle or more intensively reared ones. So for us, it's primarily those reproductive losses. Because of the seasonal nature of the production systems, they can be quite severe. And so I had a farmer call a few months ago with a story that they'd had a calf born late in the season, and it was a completely susceptible herd, a PI calf born, and they ended up with almost a 60% not pregnant rate by the end of that season, which was absolutely devastating for that herd. So in some ways, the demographic structure of New Zealand farms can actually make BVD outbreaks much, much worse for us. So for control components, that's looking at, once we know a farm has disease, what do we actually have in our arsenal to be able to prevent or manage it? And so this is a diagram I liked. I remember from my epi lectures in vet school of the bucket and tap model. And so ideally, we want to have strategies that's going to reduce the volume in the infected bucket down to zero. And the way we can do that is get rid of the number of susceptibles through vaccination, natural exposure, maternal immunity, and genetic selection. We can prevent disease transmission, so we can turn off the tap from S to I with things like movement restrictions or better hygiene for shared equipment, or double fencing to prevent nose-to-nose contact with neighboring herds. We can directly reduce the number of infecteds. Usually that's through test and cull in the case of BVD, or quarantining like we've seen a lot with COVID. And lastly, we can try to increase that recovery from infections, usually by treatments, whether it's antibiotics or other antimicrobials. So we're very fortunate with BVD that the control measures are very, very effective. And so in New Zealand, we have 2 vaccinations for BVD. One is Bovillus from MSD, the other is Ultravac from Zoetis. They have about an 85 to 95% efficacy in the field at preventing fetal infections. We also have very good diagnostic tests. So at the animal level, the PCR and antigen ELISA are almost 100% sensitive and specific for detecting PIs. And then our bulk milk testing and pooled serum antibody ELISA for dry stock are also very, very good screening tests. And we know that things like double fencing, quarantine, and hygiene are very effective, not only for protecting against BVD, but also a number of infectious diseases. And so what we did when we had this list of tools available to us is we worked with farmers and veterinarians to come up with like a little checklist of how they might actually implement them. And so this was what we used to inform how we made the control programs, or how we designed them in our simulation models. So we had our screening test to look for the BVD status of the breeding herd. If that came back positive, there was an option to do what we call a PI hunt, or testing individual animals to find PIs. There's our screening checklist for those different biosecurity risk factors that allow BVD to get into a herd and spread within a herd. And then if we can't manage those adequately, there are vaccines to help protect the fetus from infections. And we also have annual calf testing, which can help us catch those breakthrough PI calves that are born. And so this framework informed how we designed the herd level simulations, control programs for our simulation models, as well as our national ones. So the next question, like once we have a good understanding of the demographics and the disease and the control measures, is picking what level of complexity we need to actually capture those important dynamics. And I'm probably preaching to the choir with this, but we've got our very simple models, which are like little SIR ones, but tend to be deterministic, homogeneous mixing, continuous time, fixed conditions, right the way up to these stochastic individual-based models with network modeling of movements between herds, often operating in discrete time. And some of the really neat simulation models now also allow adaptive changes during the lifespan of the model to accommodate how the epidemiology of the disease is changing in the simulations. Obviously, something like this is much, much easier to run than something very complicated like this. So for the BVD simulation model, we decided to go with a stochastic individual-based metapopulation model using discrete time. That was mainly for 2 reasons. One, with the seasonal production systems, it's very hard to capture the dynamics well with one of the simple compartmental models, because it just does not accommodate the very discrete events that happen in the animal's life cycle. So that's why we decided to do do the metapopulation model with this. So we had the within herd dynamics that we're still assuming homogeneous mixing between groups within the herd. And then we modeled the between herd dynamics using a network model. So that included movement contacts based on what we know from the animal movement data, as well as local contacts from things like nose to nose, spread over fence lines, and shared yards or equipment. And we also went individual based just because a lot of the effects of BVD depend on the immunology of the individual animals, as well as what production state they're in. And this was much easier to track using individual animals. So that was the basic setup for us. The unfortunate part with it is it ended up being a very big model to run with about 10 million cattle. So it sort of limited what we were able to do in terms of number of simulations. I'll chat about that in a little bit. So once we had the structure in place, the next question was around how do we actually estimate the parameters to run the model? And the things we had to consider were the population demographics. So being able to build that metapopulation model, we needed to understand the number of herds, the size of herds, their location, the movement patterns between them, as well as making inferences about the different management structures within those herds to inform how we grouped cattle and moved them through those different states. We also need to know about the disease frequency, so the prevalence of BVD, both at the industry level, so the number of herds that are infected, as well as within herds, so the number of animals within a herd that would be infected. For transmission, we need to know the incidence, the transmission coefficients, as well as risk factors for transmission. We need to know the clinical impacts, and so that's that list I mentioned before, those reproduction and production effects. How much of an effect does it have, which animals does it have an effect on, and what's going to be the duration of those effects. For diagnostic test performance, we need to know the sensitivity and specificity. And then for those interventions, we need to know how effective they are and how long they last. So for the BVD-free model, we have what's called the NAIT system here, the National Animal Identification and Tracing System, and that's the national database that all farmers are technically supposed to register their herds and register movements between the herds. It's just came into place in the early teens, and we've really only started to get good quality data from this in the past couple of years because there's been some issues with compliance and some teething issues with the system itself. So we're originally starting these models back in 2017. We actually had a very fuzzy picture of the cattle demographics in New Zealand. We know there's about 10 million total. Depending on what you use as your cutoff for a commercial herd, we think there's about 11,500 dairy and about 10,000 commercial beef breeding herds, probably another 20,000 ones that just raise small numbers of animals for fattening or commercial fattening operations. But we weren't as interested in those from a BVD perspective because the main epidemiology is linked to pregnancy. So we had to do some statistical gymnastics from this data to try to make inferences about the herd size, location, management structure, and movements. We had something of a reasonable picture of what cattle production in New Zealand looked like. So in terms of disease frequency, that was also a little bit more challenging because, well, at least for the dairy industry, because of bulk milk testing, we now have about 75 to 80% of herds in New Zealand that are doing annual bulk milk tests, but only about 5 to 10% of beef herds that are doing any annual testing. And when all that data gets submitted to the 4 main diagnostic labs, it often doesn't have the herd identification or the production type. And so trying to use that to estimate the prevalence of disease was actually quite challenging. So the way we estimated this was through one cross-sectional survey that was done in 2015, where there's about 350 herds. Vets were offered free diagnostic tests in exchange for getting their farmers to fill out a one-page form with some basic risk factors. That was an incentive to try to get some data. And then we also were lucky enough to get copies of anonymized data from the 4 diagnostic labs. And so we were able to generate maps of seroprevalence and prevalence of bulk milk positive herds here. And so we've got some hotspots in New Zealand, which are our main dairy areas here. And so from that, we estimate that about 15 to 25% of dairy herds are actively infected, 45 to 55% of beef herds. And there's some risk factors that sort of let us take a better guess at which herds might be infected, but since we don't have a national database for BVD, it was very difficult to do that. For the transmission coefficients and risk factors, we took that cross-sectional survey data and looked at specific things that made herds at risk for being seropositive. And so the main risk factors here, like many countries, are your animal movements and lots of neighbors that are potentially infected with BVD. We also did some longitudinal studies. One was a retrospective study looking at bulk milk testing data in dairy herds to get an idea of the annual incidence of BVD outbreaks in dairy herds. And then we also ran a prospective cohort study in beef herds where we sampled cattle before and after mating to be able to measure the seroconversion rates and estimate the within herd transmission rates in extensive herds. So from that, it seems like about 3 to 5% of cattle herds in New Zealand will have a BVD incursion every year. And we tend to have a lot lower transmission rates in New Zealand. So we estimated at about 0.11 new infections per PI per day in a herd, whereas dairy herds up north, it tends, I think, to be about 0.5 or 0.6. And so this is a reflection of having those very, very extensive systems where cattle are just not mixing homogeneously enough in those fields to cause very effective transmission. And that's why natural immunity and natural vaccination, as they call it, does not work here at all. In terms of those other parameters, I mentioned the clinical impacts, the diagnostic test performance, and the efficacy of interventions. That was primarily done from a literature search because there's been so much good research done on that already. And a lot of those things are going to be very similar regardless of which country you end up being in. So for the outputs from the model, once we have the simulation set up, is what are we going to use to compare those different disease control strategies? And so there's the epidemiological ones where you can plot your little epidemic curves and look to see how fast you have a decrease in prevalence and incidence. There's your standard economic ones and the benefit cost ratios and time to break even. And the one I find the more fascinating one is the social reasons for disease control. Because after talking to a lot of farmers around this, many of them weren't actually doing voluntary BVD control for the economics. They hated coming out and seeing dead calves. They were tired of having to treat scours. They wanted to do something better for the next generation of farmers. And I think it's fascinating to understand the social motivations around this as well. We just haven't found a good way of incorporating those into our decision-making models yet. So for the BVD one, we did the standards. We had prevalence curves, we did benefit cost ratios, we did years to the break-even point. We also, because we were running those within herd simulation models, got very good estimates of how much a BVD outbreak costs a herd. And so it's, if you're interested, $22 per cow per year, New Zealand dollars for dairy, and about 41 per beef. So that was telling us that it is definitely economical to control BVD within a herd. And then for our national program, we tested 8 different ones and looked at things like how long it took to achieve eradication and what the benefit cost ratios were for that. So the other things we had to decide around, how do we actually set those simulations to run from start to finish? So we had to think about our starting values, the burn-in periods, how long we're going to run the simulations, which combinations of those control programs to test, and the number of simulations to run. I remember trying to look up like standards around like what we should actually be doing for that. It seems so variable in the literature that a lot was based on just computational expense. So the slower it took to run, the less you did. We took the approach of looking for a stabilization of the standard errors of the mean for those key model outputs. So we ran enough simulations until it looked like we weren't getting any additional variability or any additional information added from it. So we set the starting values to match our industry demographics and BVD prevalence. So the model had a 5-year burn-in period, which allowed the demographics to stabilize. We introduced disease, and we had a 40-year burn-in period to allow the prevalence to stabilize. We chose 8 different national eradication programs based on expert opinion and our knowledge of what worked in individual herds, and we let those run over 15-year periods. And then we ended up doing 100 simulations per program because that was adequate to give us a good idea of whether or not that program was expected to work. And so this is just a map of where herds in New Zealand are concentrated. So these are big dairy areas along here. We've got a lot of our beef farms up along here. So this is another area I find really interesting, is the idea of model uncertainty, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think when we think of sensitivity analysis, we tend to think of just changing the model parameters to see how much those different output values change. But what I'm actually really interested in is how wrong does it have to be before it changes the decision we would make from that model? So, for example, if our choices were do nothing or test a cull or vaccination, if our model is always telling us test and cull regardless of how much we fiddle with the parameters, that would give me more confidence in making a decision around using test and cull as the control strategy compared to saying, well, we changed the value for transmission, and we got a 30% increase in this other value. While that's useful, I think from a practical perspective, when you're looking to use these models to make decisions, I would really like to see us start taking this sort of mindset of what point, how wrong does it have to be before we would make it what would essentially be a wrong decision from this. So we didn't do too much of a sensitivity analysis for these models. And we looked primarily at the transmission rates of TI animals compared with PI animals, just because we didn't have as good estimates of those from New Zealand data. We also modified the prevalence of PI animals on neighboring farms. That was trying to get an estimate of how much local transmission had an impact. And the reason we really needed a sensitivity analysis on this is because we didn't have good data on where farms are located. And so we had to do a lot of inferences about the level of contact between neighboring farms. The other one was around the mortality of PI animals. In other countries, they seem to have a shorter lifespan than in New Zealand. So a lot of our New Zealand PI animals will last quite long and end up going into the breeding herd. But overall, it didn't make that much of an impact on the model. Yes, it changed some of the specific values around the cost and benefit and time to eradication. But overall, it still told us that the specific programs we looked at, which ones of those would be the most beneficial for New Zealand. And one of the things I actually would have liked to do with that too, what we're planning on doing in the future is building an interface for those models. And so people can go in and actually modify some of those values themselves, particularly around the assumptions around herd management and herd size and the economics of prices of cattle, milk prices, stock prices, because those are things that are going to change like regardless of how good your model is. So it'd be really nice to have some sort of tool that people can actually play with these and look to see how much those changes would impact their own business. So the last sort of question around this is once we've got all these values together and outputs from the model, how do we know that they're actually useful or that the model is behaving reasonably? And so I liked this framework from the paper I list below, that we can look at evidence from the model development process to make sure we went through a robust system for developing it. And so does our conceptual model for the disease and the demographics make sense? Did we do a good job estimating the parameters? And did we actually implement the code correctly? The number of times when I was first starting to learn how to code that we'd get interesting results, and interesting was usually a code bug rather than anything actually coming from the model. So having good processes in place to manage quality control around coding. And the second part of it is examining evidence from model performance. And so the plausibility, or as I like to call it, the laugh test, do the results actually make sense? Are we getting consistent results from the model? How much does that parameter sensitivity evaluation change things? Is what we're getting consistent with other models? And if we compare it against data, does it match what we're seeing in the real world? So I think in general, as veterinary epidemiologists, we're pretty good at this one, the model development. We're pretty good at looking at the internal comparisons and comparing with what other people have published. I think one of our weaknesses is the third point around examining the consequences of model-based decisions. And so that would be taking your models, plugging in real herd data, looking to see what the model predicts, and then following those herds over time to see if the changes that were predicted actually do match that. And I appreciate that's a very difficult thing to do because oftentimes it's not just BVD on a farm, and particularly with our seasonal herds, like one other change could make those model predictions look like they're completely off, even though they might have actually been accurate in that situation. So I think again, that's one of our weaknesses, but very, very difficult to actually get good data on that. So we're pretty happy that it passed the LAF test. The model structure was based on really well-established knowledge about BVD and farming systems in New Zealand. When we ran the simulation models, after the 40-year burn-in period, within herd prevalence and industry prevalence stabilized to the values we'd seen reported in the literature, and the results we got in terms of the economics of control were very, very consistent with other published studies. So we're pretty happy that at least generating something reasonable to make decisions from. So that's the process we went through for developing it. And it's sort of a systematic thing, but I just realized now, like in hindsight, going back through, there's a lot of things I probably would have done differently, and a lot of data I think we could have done better. It's just you don't sort of know until you're through all these processes what exactly you need to know. That being said, back to our original research question, which is, should we actually put a national control program in place? I feel like we kind of just went 360 degrees back to what we sort of knew going into it, that it was going to end up being cost effective for New Zealand. And so what we found for us was that if dairy herds just tested their calves annually, if all beef breeding herds vaccinated their mixed age cows and replacement heifers every year, and if everyone took a stab at improving their boundary biosecurity, we could have national eradication within about 10 years at a benefit cost ratio of about 1.8. And I think there's some other measures you could tweak that would make it a little bit more effective, but in general, for a $350 million investment, they get $645 million back. Just for comparison, that is about the same amount they have currently spent on Mycoplasma bovis, which has almost no production impacts in New Zealand. So you would think after presenting this information, industry would be really, really on board with doing national control, but we have struggled to get this up in front of the policymakers around this, just because so much has been going on with Mycoplasma and COVID. So kind of where we're stalled at the moment is we know it's a really good idea. It's just turned out not to be the right time for a number of other political and social reasons for getting a national eradication program in place for New Zealand, which is a little bit of a shame, because it'd be nice to add that to our list of eradicated diseases. So the main thing I actually learned from this project is that the simulation model, it's really not about the numbers. It is entirely a social science experiment. And for me as a data science person, that is absolutely terrifying. But it doesn't matter how good your model is or how good the numbers coming out of it are until you can understand what motivates people and how to get these outputs into action in the field. It really doesn't matter what you do simulation modeling wise. A lot of that is trust, and so being very open about what you're doing with the models, what the strengths and limitations are, people understanding that you're doing quality work to inform that. And it's also, I think, just understanding what motivates people. And so, as I think I mentioned before, we tend to focus on the economic impacts of disease, but there's a whole host of other reasons why people might choose to engage in disease control. So in terms of what we're planning next with this project, so the BBD-free project formally ended back in April, and I was enjoying BBD freedom for a few months, but now we're looking more towards getting a voluntary program in place, or at least more resources in place to support voluntary control. So a lot of what we're doing is working with farmers and vets to understand how they actually make BBD plans, and whether providing them with more structured information can have better discussions and help them pick strategies that might work better for their herd. And we've also got a lot of new extension materials up on our website to help promote education around BBD. So I'm still optimistic that at some point we'll get a voluntary scheme, if not a compulsory scheme in New Zealand. Just, I think, waiting a little bit longer to see how things settle down from COVID. I do have a ton of people to thank, and I probably should have thanked them earlier, but this was a massive team effort with this project. So particularly Junhee Han, who's our PhD and now postdoc, who did most of the modeling work on this, and then Cord Hoary and Jenny Weston, who are my colleagues at Massey, who are also heavily involved with the science behind this, our funders, who were government and industry, and lots of partners who provided us with data and just listened to me picking up the phone, asking them questions about New Zealand farming and BBD. So really a big team effort with that. So I don't know if that was useful or not, but that was just sort of my experiences working with developing a national control program using modeling approaches. And honestly, I think I've just generated a lot more answers than questions. So if you have answers, I'm happy to listen to them.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. It was really very interesting, and I am very interested in the BVD model, so it was double interest. So really, thanks for this presentation. If you have questions in the room, I would say.
Oh, I see one popped up from Helen. I see one popped up from Helen in the chat. So how long did you run the model for, and did you consider what effort it would take to maintain BBD-free status? So we ran it over a course of 15 years. And of those 8 control programs we tested, 4 of them worked, and they achieved eradication within that. So that seemed to be an adequate time frame. And we were actually very lucky in New Zealand in terms of maintaining BBD-free status, because we were an island in the middle of nowhere. And so we don't have the same problems of cattle coming across the border, or a lot of domestic and international travel that can spread disease really, really easily. The main risk for reimportation in New Zealand would be through things like semen or bovine serum, but the processes MPI has in place are really, really stringent about it. So it's very, very minimal risk of reintroduction, which is why disease eradication in New Zealand is fantastic, because we're just an island.
Question from Egil?
Yep, so integrating economic, social decision-making, the EPI model. I think that's absolutely critical. The thing I think I find challenging about that is for economics, we have a very clear number. And so if it's, a benefit cost ratio of 3, we can compare that to a benefit cost ratio of 2. But how do we put a quantitative value on, not having to treat sick cabs so you can spend the morning at your son's baseball game or something like that? And I think until we have a better way of capturing those, it's much, much more difficult to put it into the model. But I think that's an excellent point.
You raised your hand. Is it related to that question? Yeah. Okay. Your mic is.
No, I'm from thank you very much. It's easier just to talk. What you were talking about cost effectiveness is more or less at the end of the epi modeling, calculating the cost effectiveness of the program, is it? And I was wondering if you, because I'm sometimes thinking about how to incorporate actually the actions of farmers in the modeling, and because it has also an impact on the epidemiology and the other way around. And indeed, it takes into account whether you can go to your son's soccer game, yes or no. That's
absolutely. I don't have an answer for that. I know there's been some simulation models where they've looked at like farmer behavior in response to different things. And so like they'll assume that if there's a high infection pressure, they're more likely to voluntarily adopt control measures, things like that. I haven't seen any that have looked specifically at those social impacts. I'm not quite sure how you would go about actually quantifying them. That's why I think actually, I see Andrew Wilson's question in the model. Can you elaborate on what you would have changed? I think that social science aspect of it is so much more important than the quantitative outputs. I think going back to it, we originally planned to do a big extension campaign afterwards to present those results. I wish I would have gotten on the ground earlier with farmers and vets and really sat down and understood how do you go about making decisions about BVD. And so, you didn't have a control program this year and you had one next year. What was it for you that tipped you over the edge? Was it having a neighbor that had a really bad outbreak? Was it, going out and seeing all those calves with birth defects? And we had one farmer I talked to was really passionate about protecting the industry for future generations of farmers. And so for him, like getting BVD controlled so his son had a good farm to inherit and a good business to inherit, that was his motivation. And so I think I wish I'd gone back and just done that qualitative work ahead of time. So I think we would have gotten a lot better data and probably a lot more useful outputs from the model. What else would I would have changed? Not running a research program in the middle of a Mycoplasma bovis outbreak, because every single time we went to do something like our national eradication campaign or control measures, they would have like another announcement from Mycoplasma and industry would tell us to stop communicating out messages. And so the day we were supposed to launch the BVD project, we had the Mycoplasma bovis outbreak, and so we couldn't do anything for like 3 months. And then we're going to do our big national campaign, and they announced eradication. So industry asked us to be quiet with our messaging for 3 months. It's like, what am I supposed to do? We can't actually go out and collect data. So we just ended up getting not as much engagement as we would have hoped for with the project. Any other questions?
Corinne, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, my question's a bit related. Thanks a lot for this nice talk. Something I struggle with as well. So the dynamics of policy and the decision making, that's of course hard to align with. Can you comment a little bit about we as modelers, how we can do a better job of aligning our results, or like getting a better connection to the actual decision makers to make sure to have a bigger impact, I suppose?
That's an interesting and a very interesting question. One of the things I think we struggle with BVD is that it was important to us, but in terms of what was important to policymakers, there were things like far higher on the list. And so even just trying to get the people we needed into a room to make decisions about it was very, very difficult, because for them, like BVD's been around forever. It's one of those diseases that's ticking along, so it's not an emergency. And so they're much more concerned about the new environmental regulations in place or how to manage Mycoplasma bovis that's coming in. And I think for us, it would be better to actually sit down again and talk to them first and see like, what are the major issues you want to focus on? And then maybe looking to see if we could have tackled those maybe instead of BVD, or started putting in those little seeds about, hey, you just spent 350 million on Mycoplasma. Did you know? Had you spent it on BVD control? Things like that. So I think sometimes we're guilty as epidemiologists and guilty as vets, as we have our own interests and we don't necessarily understand what other people's interests are. and going out and talking to them ahead of time and understanding their barriers. So I probably should ask questions like, okay, we're thinking about putting together research around BVD, like what do you see as the barriers, or what would you like to see, or what would change your mind about it? What would you need to tip you over the edge? And it's not always economics, unfortunately. It's what's going to be most politically expedient.
And Caroline, in New Zealand, do you have some places where the different actors that you mentioned, so epidemiologists, the decision makers, maybe farmers, the stakeholders, can interact for animal health issues? Have you is it already organized, or?
It's an interesting country because we have like one vet council, we have one regulatory agency, we have one vet school, but it just seems to like operate on different tiers. And so like everyone sort of at my level in all those different industry organizations and government organizations is very, very much on board with BVD. The struggle we've had is like kicking up that next notch to the people who actually sign off on things like getting a national BVD database in place, or getting a sign off on a voluntary control scheme or a compulsory control scheme. And so I think there's still a little bit of disconnect between the layers or the tiers of folks in New Zealand. And I'm not quite sure the best way to bridge that. I think there's a lot of positive things happening. They've just changing things of how the MPI, which is our government agency, is run, and there seems to be a lot more progress happening there. I think it's just us being a little bit more vocal and getting out there. But again, I'm a data person. I love hiding behind my computer. So doing the social science stuff of going out and engaging is just not my thing, but I know I have to get better at it.
Is there any other questions from the room? Otherwise, I have a question, so I can ask my own question. It's about the relationship between the model you've developed and the data you can catch from the field. How do you manage that? If because you have mentioned that you can estimate some parameters from literature or looking at risk factors and so on, but sometimes there are some parameters that you cannot observe directly, and also you can have so you mentioned also that the data you had on cattle herds was anonymized. So you cannot always relate some data source with others because you don't know who is who. So you cannot say, okay, the epidemiological data I have, it's the same herds as the demographic data I have. So how do you manage that? So, but that's my first question. And the second is, how do you manage to go after what has been observed? So to go one step further and to go up to non-historical data, so accounting for trends or for change in practices or whatever you can have in the short term.
So I'll break that down to several points. So one of the challenges we do have in New Zealand is around good data, because the NATE systems, our traceability system, wasn't introduced until 2013, and then we didn't really start getting good compliance until mycoplasma hit. And so it's been a very big struggle, and just the way they set it up makes it quite difficult to actually do a lot of the things we need to do. But it's undergone a review, and so there's some changes to make that more useful. What I really would have liked to have gotten done with the BVD project is the ability, like in the BVD Free England scheme, to link BVD test results directly to the herd number and the animal number. And so one of the silver linings from mycoplasma is government invested a lot of in developing a lot of the infrastructure to do that. And so there's now systems to automatically upload data from the diagnostic labs. It's, again, we're just waiting to get the decision maker to tick off to allow those changes to happen in the database. But that would certainly make it much easier for us to track trends over time. But the challenge with that is, well, dairy herds are very good at doing testing. We still only see about 5 to 10% of beef herds doing testing. And so a big part of that will be engaging with vets and just trying to make more people aware and offering them the options to know their status for BVD, because it's pointless having the database if no one's doing the testing to enter into the database. On the beef side too, another big challenge we have here is because they're extensive farming systems, most farmers aren't capturing a lot of good electronic data on herd performance. And so if you're trying to look for a database, it's going to have things like growth rates and reproductive performance parameters. It just does not exist, which makes it very difficult for us to look at the economic impacts of BVD. So that's why for the first part of this project, we ended up doing field studies. And so we had 75 beef herds. We did sampling of heifers, and we did some management questionnaires one season. And then we sampled them again after mating to look at seroconversions. That let us look at our within herd transmission rates. And then we compared the performance between seasons, but we didn't see a huge amount of effects from BVD outbreaks from that. So ideally, you have herds that are doing very good BVD control, have very good performance data that they're tracking, and are willing to share that with you, which we're not quite at that stage in New Zealand. I think that goes to Jorn's question of, can you explain if the model will be validated using features? So the idea with that extension campaign is we had those management checklists that had those different things that farmers could do to control BVD. And we had an accompanying questionnaire that asked them about their herd performance parameters. And so what we would have loved to do is have farmers fill that out 1 year and then compare that next year and look at the farmers that cleared BVD and those that had a new outbreak. And we would have plugged their data into the simulation models to see what it would have predicted. And then we would have looked at different confounders that could have happened to change that. So that's what we actually wanted to do. And possibly some work in the pipeline to do that going forward. So I'm just looking at Colin's questions. Yes, so I think the epidemiological ones is important to present as well. So people want to know things like how fast the disease is going to disappear and then the value of that as well. I think there's lots of different ways of presenting the results. It's really understanding what your target audience is looking for the outcomes from it.
Then if you want to ask a question, I see you raise your hand.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it was kind of a bit on the same topic of Pauline's question about uncertainty in the data, but a more broad question of, if you don't have that data, would you say it was better to kind of go for a binary kind of just, if you can ignore that parameter exists, or so for example, immigration, if you don't have any idea about the immigration into a population, say that you weren't an island, would you say it's better to just operate that model as a closed population, or would you say, we know that there is some immigration, so we'll estimate a number and do some sensitivity analyses?
I think it goes back to the point I made of with the sensitivity analysis of, does doing that change your decision? So if you set up your model and you had a closed system and it said you should vaccinate and do this annual screening test, what I would probably do, like now moving forward, is keep changing the models and see like how much does it have to change before it says that that's no longer our best option. And that might answer it for you, because it might say, well, you could have just the cattle pouring across the borders and it's still going to tell you that that's the most effective one. And so then that parameter doesn't necessarily matter that much. But if it's something that like a little bit changes your decision, that might be where you say like, right, this is a limitation of the model. Please, can I have funding to go and study this and figure out what those actual parameters are? So that's the other reason for doing sensitivity analysis, is to know what those critical control points are that you can go and actually do the research around it.
Great, thank you.
Question, I look at the chat. No, there is no question in the chat. Maybe you can also elaborate a bit more, Caroline, on the possible interference that you might have between the vaccination and the test, and how do you manage that in a control program at a country scale?
Sorry, was it about which ones to implement and when? I didn't quite catch the question.
Oh, sorry. You mentioned that in New Zealand you can use testing, but you can also use vaccination. And I was wondering if there is any interference between the two, and how do you manage that at the large scale, such a country scale in a program?
That's mainly only an issue for beef herds. And so I didn't explain too much about the model results, but the challenge we have with beef herds in New Zealand is that calving occurs in a very narrow window, and mating occurs shortly after that. And so any PI animals that are born into the herd are going to be circulating with their dams for about 6 months, causing the PI infections to occur. With the pooled serum antibody ELISA, that's the serological screening test. We can't run those, unfortunately, until the animals are 10 months of age. That's after they've been separated with the dam. And so if, for example, a herd had an outbreak, we wouldn't catch that until after it was too late to have gone and vaccinated the animals to protect them. And so that's why we made that recommendation of blanket vaccinating all the breeding cattle, beef breeding cattle, just because we know we can't test for an outbreak until after it's too late to control it. And so for national eradication, just preemptively putting the vaccines in place would solve that. It can interfere with the antibody-based tests, but that's why we tend to sample the unvaccinated cattle that are 10 months of age. So that would be before they receive their first dose as heifers. For dairy herds, it doesn't matter so much because we can use the bulk milk PCR as the screening test, which is cheap. And then we can just tag and test the replacement calves pretty much immediately after birth. And that's why we made that recommendation for dairy herds, because if you test them after birth, they are off the property by the time you even hit the mating period. So there's very minimal risk of getting BVD exposures from them. And even if there is one, you're getting rid of that replacement heifer. And so it's not going to come up the replacement heifer pipeline for them. So that's why it worked. And there's no interference with either the PCR or antigen on those tests. So that's one of the reasons I like BVD. We have fantastic diagnostic tests. It makes me happy.
Maybe I missed the answer. Did you answer the question from John? So the question was, can you explain if the model will be validated using future results of the BVD control program?
That's what I mentioned about getting those flow charts in place, getting farmers and vets to fill them out, plugging their data into the model and seeing what happened next. And that was supposed to happen between 2019 and 2020, but COVID happened. So that part didn't, but some plans to continue that research, hopefully next year if we can, because we've just missed this calving season at the moment.
I have a final question, so that's nice to have room for questions. Did you use the model? Because one of the problems with BVD is that when you succeed in decreasing the prevalence, but not yet reaching eradication, then you increase for the free herds, you increase the risk that they will have larger outbreaks because they have no herd immunity anymore. And did you try to quantify that using your model? Because I think it's a very interesting issue to see how it's changed from when the herd prevalence was quite large up to when it's lower but not nil, and how it impacts the risk for free herd.
We have actually seen that in the real data. And so in the dairy industry, since they introduced bulk milk testing about 10 years ago, the prevalence of PCR positive herds has gone from 15% down to 5%. And if you look at the antibody ELISA results in those herds, we've gone from a lot with very, very high down to a lot more that are just high or moderate. And so that's reflective of the herd immunity actually decreasing. So we do know with those herds, if they get another outbreak, it's going to be much worse for them. I believe in the simulation model, it accounted for the within herd prevalence. We were able to get estimates of how much that SP ratio drops in a negative herd. And then there's estimates of what the SP ratio correlates to in terms of herd immunity. So we're able to, I believe, assign animal status based on that. So it is possible to account for it. It's just a little bit of fudging sometimes with the numbers because we don't have great data around it. But certainly that's a huge issue for the dairy industry now, because they're much more risk than the beef herds of getting another introduction and more severe consequences from it.